What's one historical fact that they won't teach you in school? Story 1. The circumstances surrounding the death of Meriwether Lewis, of Lewis and Clark, are shrouded in conspiracy. In the months leading up to his death, many people reported that Lewis had become paranoid, claiming that he was being followed and that his life was in danger. In a desperate attempt for help, he sent a letter to his close friend, and then President Thomas Jefferson, to request an audience. While traveling along the Natchez Trace, he stayed a night at an inn. During the night, the owner reported hearing multiple gunshots, but never went out to check on the source. In the morning, Lewis was found dead in his cabin, sitting against the wall looking at the door, rifle in hand and shot in the back. In addition, while the room was ransacked, the only missing objects of note were Lewis's riding back and personal documents.
After an official investigation, his death was ruled a suicide, and all further inquiry into the instance have been barred by the U.S. government. While Lewis himself did not have any immediate descendants, his extended family have submitted requests every year to have his body exhumed in order to confirm the cause of death. To this day, their requests have unanimously been denied.
Story 2. When the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb, Castle Bravo, on Enewetak Atoll in the Marshall Islands in 1958, it was many times more powerful than calculated. The residents of Enewetak and Bikini Atolls had previously been forcibly relocated to Rongelap Atoll. Rongelap was downwind from the Castle Bravo radiation cloud. The U.S. did not evacuate them for 2 days and allowed them to return only a week later, even though the radiation levels were highly unsafe as we understand now. From 1958 to 1984, the U.S. repeatedly refused to evacuate the Rongelap residents, even as the birth defects and cancer rates continued. It was finally Greenpeace in 1984 who assisted in moving many of them to Machado Island, in Kwajalein Atoll. If you go to Machado today, the signs on the church and school still say Rongelap. There is evidence that this refusal to evacuate was a calculated decision to study the long-term effects of radiation exposure in humans.
Edit. Corrected Castle Bravo to 1958.
Story 3. Back in the th century, small opposition newspapers in the Netherlands were called Lilliputters, midgets, because of their small size, which was a way to avoid having to pay for the newspaper stamp. The best example of this are the papers published by the fanatical Republican Eilert Meter, who received imprisonment for lèse-majesté before being invited to meet King William II in person, who offered him an allowance if he ceased publicizing. Meter later went back to publishing anyway, but admitted in his writings that he found the king a kind and friendly person. He was just opposed to having a king.
Okay, you simply do not learn this in school because it is obscure and relatively unimportant. But still, a similar thing happened in Baden during the German Revolution of 1918. While all other crowned heads in Germany were deposed, revolutionaries in Baden took their time with it, as the king was extremely popular. Children would run to him during his daily walks, because he would always give them candies. He donated to charity, refused to censor press in his kingdom against Prussia's wishes, and people in the street addressed him not with Your Majesty, but with Herr König, Mr. King. Then when they came to his palace and told him he was now deposed, they apologized for deposing him and told him that, sich wegen dem System, it's because of the system and not because of him. They then recommended he should run for president of Baden in the next election, and that they would all vote for him.
Story 4. My great-grandfather was completely changed after his experience fighting the Japanese. The worst parts weren't the battles themselves, but what the Japanese left behind after they would retreat. Truly horrifying.
He was never a racist person, as far as I've been told prior to the war, but he came back from it a changed man. Stopped going to church, started drinking to cope with what was almost certainly PTSD, and had developed a burning hatred for Japs, as he would call them. He was very avert to talking about his experiences during the war, but when he did, he spoke very highly of the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, who were the natives of what was at the time the territory of Papua, that fought tooth and nail alongside the Australian soldiers, even going on what were effectively suicide scouting missions just to gather intel. Truly remarkable people fighting for their land, and it's a shame not much is said about them today. My great-grandfather even said that it was unlikely they would have won against the Japanese along the Kokoda Trail, had it not been for the support given by the native population. For this, it makes it all the more disgusting that Japan has yet to acknowledge to the full extent just how cruel they were to the natives on the islands they occupied, and to appropriately give reparations for the irreparable harm they caused to the indigenous peoples and their cultures. There is still so much generational trauma that still exists to this day in Papua New Guinea as a result of the Japanese army, and it makes it all the more frustrating to see blatant denialism from Japan while there are still people today being materially and psychologically affected by their past actions.
Story 5. Rosa Parks wasn't the first.
Ida B. Wells, a pioneering African-American journalist and civil rights activist. In 1884, Wells was traveling by train when she was ordered to give up her seat in the first-class ladies' car and move to the smoking car, which was already crowded. When she refused, the conductor and 2 men forcibly removed her from the car. Wells took legal action against the railroad company and initially won her case in the local circuit court, receiving a $500 award. However, the railroad company appealed, and in 1887, the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed the lower court's ruling, concluding that her persistence was not in good faith to obtain a comfortable seat for the short ride. Wells was ordered to pay court costs. This incident was a catalyst for Wells's lifelong commitment to civil rights and social justice. She became a prominent journalist, co-owning and writing for the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper, where she reported on racial segregation and inequality. Throughout her career, Wells documented and fought against the lynching of African Americans, becoming one of the most influential leaders in the early civil rights movement. Ida B. Wells's courageous stand against racial discrimination on public transportation predated Rosa Parks's more widely known protest by several decades, highlighting the long history of resistance to segregation in the United States.
Story 6. In 1914, the Serbian government and military did conspire and organize the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand with nationalist terrorists, and that was already known back then. World War I wasn't just Austria-Hungary and Germany looking for excuses to go to war and blaming Serbia for something one Serbian guy did.
BTW, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia that basically said, forbid nationalist propaganda against us, punish the military officials that we 100% know are implied in the affair, and let us investigate on your soil, with the last part being what they refused.
Story 7. The guys defending the Alamo were the bad guys.
Texas was Mexico at the time. To attract settlers to the land, Mexico allowed American farmers to move there and bring their enslaved workers with them. Slavery was not something Mexico was crazy about, and soon banned slavery in the entire country except for Texas. A few years later, they tried to ban it in Texas. That's when the Texas Revolution started. The Texans were fighting to keep slavery, not for freedom from an oppressive government. Not everyone at the Alamo died. The enslaved workers were spared and are largely the reason we know what happened. If you visit the Alamo today, or at least when I did in 2022, most of the information is left out of the booklet and signage. It does mention the enslaved workers by name, but that's about it. Fighting to preserve slavery isn't the narrative they want to display today. I remember learning about the Alamo in school and slavery wasn't mentioned, and then how absent it was from the actual site.
Story 8. I grew up in the US and went to different schools, all which I'd consider to be decent school systems. Every time we learned about democracy as a concept, it was heavily focused on ancient Greek and Roman democracy, which makes sense given that it is a basis for a lot of the foundation of democracy in the US. But that was the extent of what we learned about democracy. The way it was taught made it seem like democracy was extremely rare and only existent in prominent and advanced Western civilizations like the Greeks and Romans. It failed to cover that democratic systems are more common historically than that, and often relatively short-lived because they are fragile. With this in mind, it failed to stress the importance of handling an individual's capacity to vote with great care because of how easily that can slip away. It also failed to teach about any sort of alternate voting systems or perspectives in democracy.
A good portion of the reason that the electoral system in the US is as broken as it is because probably of the populace is functionally in a cave where they know nothing different and know of no other options to be explored. Or at least that's my perspective.
Story 9. When I went to school, we were taught that the American Revolution came about because King George III arbitrarily imposed taxes on the American colonists.
Many years later, talking to a historian of the 18th century, I learned that the colonists had begged England for aid during the earlier French and Indian War, promising to repay it all. but then, once the war was over, reneged on that promise. After repeated and repeatedly rebuffed requests for repayment, and after fair warning, Parliament imposed taxes on the colonies, which were still lower than the taxes British subjects actually living in England were paying, in order to recoup those costs. Bonus fact, I also learned that, contrary to what I was taught in school, it was the colonists who drew first blood in the revolution, the HMS Gaspee incident, which, oddly, none of my history teachers had mentioned.
Story 10. The Banana Massacre occurred on December 6, 1928 in Ciénaga, Magdalena, Colombia. Workers of the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita Brands International, were on strike demanding better working conditions, such as shorter hours and fair pay. The Colombian government, under pressure from the United States and fearing that the conflict would affect the company's interests, sent in the army. Troops fired on the strikers, killing an undetermined number of people, varying according to sources from 47 official to more than 1,000 according to witnesses. The United Fruit Company, founded in the United States in 1899, had a significant impact on Latin America, influencing governments and economies, earning the nickname the Octopus for its reach and control. In 1970, the company was restructured and renamed Chiquita Brands International. Today, it remains one of the largest distributors of tropical fruits in the world, but has faced criticism for its history of labor exploitation, corruption, and environmental impact. In 2025, Chiquita Brands continues to operate globally as business as usual. Story 11. They didn't mention redlining in any of the history classes I took in high school or college. My younger sister, who went to the same high school and university, then went to law school, didn't know about it. She is a partner in a law firm and specializes in commercial real estate. I learned about it because when I used to go on Facebook, a newspaper called Atlanta Black Star showed up on my feed. It kept popping up. I am a white guy from the Pacific Northwest. I have one black friend and see my sister's brother-in-law at family gatherings. He was in the NFL, maybe me looking up his stats made it show up? I don't know. I am glad it did. I learned a lot. There's a lot of anti-white sentiment. I get why. It's counterproductive, but I don't blame them. It has convinced me we have to change a lot of things in our society. Racism is used by the rich to further classism. Story 12. After enslaved Haitians successfully overthrew French colonial rule and declared independence in 1804, Haiti was forced to pay reparations, not to its freed citizens, but to France. This payment is often referred to as the independence debt. The independence debt. Origins in under the threat of military invasion by France, Haiti was forced to agree to pay million francs, later reduced to million francs, to compensate French plantation owners for their losses after the abolition of slavery and the end of colonial rule. This sum was equivalent to several years of Haiti's GDP at the time. Economic impact. To pay this enormous debt, Haiti had to take out high-interest loans from French banks, plunging the country into a cycle of debt and poverty. The debt payments continued for over a century, crippling Haiti's economic development. Haiti's financial resources were drained, leaving little room for investment in infrastructure, education, or healthcare. 3. Final payments. Haiti completed its payments to France in 1947, over 120 years after independence. By then, the compounded interest and additional loans made the total amount paid far exceed the original demand. Broader implications. Haiti's forced reparations are widely seen as a key factor in its persistent economic struggles. The payments enriched France while devastating Haiti's economy. This case highlights the profound injustice of a system that prioritized compensating former enslavers over recognizing the rights and reparations owed to those who were enslaved. Today, many activists and scholars argue that France should repay this independence debt to Haiti as reparations for centuries of exploitation and forced payment. Story 13. During the Middle Ages, the Islamic world had dozens of openly gay leaders and philosophers. Just as a huge example, major religious leaders like Rumi, who led an entire sect of Islam, wrote about their homosexual relationships. The laws against homosexuality on the books were rarely invoked. We know this because Arabs archived extensive court records. Look up things like the Islamic Golden Age period as well. The modern narrative that Arab countries were constantly clashing with each other and regressing all the way back then, and just living in huts in the desert, is BS. There is a very proven argument that the Islamic world mostly regressed to the way it is after adopting the colonial norms from the British, who were very homophobic and forced their ideals when they took over, which is what led to these laws becoming enforced much more. Story 14. You may have seen period pieces like To Kill a Mockingbird, depict the post-Reconstruction, Jim Crow era,
of the rural American South, but it got much worse than that. The situation was often equivalent to low-key ethnic cleansing and incorporated a great deal of actual chattel slavery laundered through bad faith interpretations of the legal code of the penal system. When you hear a crazy law like it's illegal to walk while holding a bag of flour after dark, you can almost always replace after dark with while black, and expect that at some point this was enforced by local sheriffs that were on the payroll of local landowners that basically wanted all of the local black men subjugated. This extended to laws against vagrancy, unemployment, freedom of movement. Many black men spent their whole lives in prison custody on one charge or other, some of which were made rather short because the prisons didn't always have an incentive to keep them alive. We sold him to the mines. The legal recognition of that human trafficking lasted until the 1940s, in some cases, when DC got anxious about giving Japanese propagandists ammunition. Both northern and southern cities filled up with black refugees as a result. The social impetus towards racial integration and the strong backlash against it is one of the reasons that to this day we can't have nice things like public health care, why we have things like private community swimming pools, why the suburbs filled up so quickly, and why we make it so difficult to be less than upper middle class here. Black-white race relations has been a reliable wedge issue to break apart demands for reform for our entire history. There were literally widespread public protests about school integration into the 1980s. Reagan began his campaign by giving a speech about states' rights in a small town known for lynchings. The white ethno-nationalist evangelical preachers running this campaign in the Zezins after they exhausted their last court appeals just suddenly switched tracks to talking about abortion, a thing they'd never cared about before. Story 15. Technically, Abraham Lincoln enslaved more African Americans than he freed. Lincoln had spent much of his time prior to and during the Civil War insisting that he had no intention of freeing slaves. For this reason, when General McClellan signed an Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves, Lincoln chastised him and nullified the document almost at once. Later, when Great Britain decided to become involved and side with the South, Lincoln's advisors rightly declared that if this alliance was allowed to occur, the war was decided and the Union would be dissolved. The only course of action left was to change course and declare that the Civil War was a war to end slavery, because Great Britain could not in good conscience side with slavery in any war. Lincoln signed his own Emancipation Proclamation in a move to establish the Union as opposing slavery, but his document only freed slaves within states that participated in open rebellion. Many slaves under Lincoln's proclamation had to wait for the signing of the 13th Amendment to gain their freedom, and that amendment was not ratified until after his assassination. There are a great many things about Lincoln and the Civil War that tend to get missed or outright misrepresented.